There is a place at the bottom of the North Atlantic Ocean where time stopped on April 15, 1912. Nearly 4 kilometers beneath the surface, beyond sunlight, beyond sound, beyond almost everything we know, a ship rests in absolute silence. The darkness down there is not like any darkness you have experienced. It is total. It is permanent. The ship has been there for over a century, and for most of that time, no human being on Earth knew exactly where it was. That ship was the Titanic. What I want to tell you is not simply the story of how it sank. It is the story of everything it took to find it, and everything waiting at the bottom when we finally did. Because what was down there was not just wreckage, it was a question, one that took 73 years to begin answering. It began not on the water, but in Belfast, Ireland, inside the largest dry dock ever built. The year was 1909. Over the next 3 years, more than 14,000 workers arrived at the Harland and Wolff shipyard before dawn every morning. They worked in grinding heat, deafening noise, and constant danger, hammering 3 million rivets into a hull stretching 269 meters from bow to stern. Men were injured, some were killed. The ship that rose from that dock was not simply constructed, it was fought for, pound by pound, against the weight of its own ambition. By 1912, the Titanic was the largest moving object ever assembled by human hands. 46,000 tons of steel, $7.5 million, over 200 million in today's terms. Inside that hull lived heated swimming pools, Turkish baths, smoking lounges paneled in dark mahogany, and first-class dining rooms that matched the finest restaurants in London and New York. The 4 enormous funnels rising from her decks were visible for miles, projecting a power so absolute that the very idea of this ship failing seemed philosophically impossible. The press called her unsinkable. The public didn't question it. Neither, it seems, did the men who sailed her. On April 10, 1912, the Titanic departed Southampton carrying 2,224 souls. Millionaires occupied first-class suites of polished oak. Immigrant families traveled deep in the lower decks, carrying everything they owned, crossing toward the promise of America. 2,224 people, one ship, one direction. None of them knew what the ocean ahead had arranged. The night of April 14th was clear and moonless. The North Atlantic lay unusually still, glassy, cold as iron. Without waves breaking at their bases, icebergs cast no white foam, no visible warning. The Titanic had received multiple wireless ice warnings throughout the day. The messages were logged. The ship held its course at nearly full speed. At 11:40 in the evening, lookout Frederick Fleet saw something enormous rising from the darkness ahead. He rang the warning bell 3 times. Iceberg right ahead. Officers ordered an emergency turn and reversed the engines, but a ship of that mass cannot respond like something smaller. The iceberg struck the starboard side below the waterline. Contact lasted less than 10 seconds. From the upper decks, it barely registered. A shudder, a distant sound, then silence. Below the waterline, the truth was already written. The iceberg buckled hull plates along nearly 90 meters of the ship's underbelly, opening the freezing Atlantic into 6 watertight compartments. The Titanic was engineered to survive 4 flooded. 6 was a different mathematics entirely. Architect Thomas Andrews delivered the conclusion to Captain Edward Smith within the first hour. There was no revision available. The ship would sink. Distress rockets arced over black water. The band played on deck. Lifeboats were lowered, many dangerously under capacity. There were lifeboats for roughly half the people aboard. At 2:20 in the morning, the Titanic was gone. More than 1,500 people died in the freezing water. Just over 700 survived, rescued by the RMS Carpathia. When she reached the site, the ocean was still, glassy and unmarked. There was almost nothing left to see. And then the world simply lost it. If stories like this fascinate you, stories where history, ambition, and human vulnerability collide, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you think, and it allows me to keep bringing you deeper into moments like this. And I'd really like to know, what part of the Titanic story has always stayed with you? Let me know in the comments. For 73 years, the Titanic rested nearly 4,000 meters deep, and no one could say precisely where. Expeditions were proposed and abandoned. Theories multiplied. The ship became not only a tragedy, but a ghost story, growing larger in the imagination precisely because it remained invisible. The steel forged in Belfast had become myth. The breakthrough came in 1985 from American oceanographer Robert Ballard and French marine engineer Jean-Louis Michel. Rather than hunting the hull directly, Ballard proposed searching for the debris field, the trail of objects scattered across the seafloor during the ship's descent. That trail could extend from nearly a mile. It would be far harder to miss. The French team swept 80% of the search area, 320 square kilometers of absolute darkness, and found nothing. Ballard's team arrived with only the remaining 20% and a single robotic camera called Argo. For days, the monitors returned only gray mud. Then, just before 2 in the morning on September 1st, 1985, something changed. Metal appeared on the monitors. Then more. And then, rising from the sediment like something waking from a long sleep, a massive circular shape, one of the Titanic's 29 steam boilers. After 73 years of silence, the ship had finally answered. Less than a year later, Ballard returned with the deep submersible Alvin. When it descended through 4 kilometers of darkness and approached the bow, Ballard looked through the porthole and saw a wall of steel so vast it had no visible top and no visible bottom, a cliff of corroded iron rising from the abyss. But it was not the hull that stopped him. It was the shoes. Hundreds of them, scattered across the seafloor. Men's shoes, women's shoes, children's shoes, resting in pairs, side by side in the silt, because leather survives where human bodies cannot. They lay undisturbed, as though their owners had simply stepped out of them and walked somewhere the cameras could not follow. Ballard called them gravestones. The word was precise. Those shoes had outlasted everything else, the ambition, the steel, the name on the hull. 2 years later, a French-American expedition returned to recover. Over 32 dives, the submersible Untold brought 1,800 artifacts to the surface. Ceramic plates intact after falling 4,000 meters. Jewelry, luggage, a bronze cherub from the grand staircase still holding its form. Objects that had waited in total darkness for nearly 8 decades suddenly carried back into light. But the ship those objects came from is not waiting. Iron-eating bacteria have colonized every exposed metal surface of the hull, dissolving the structure at hundreds of pounds of iron per day. The deck railings are gone. The crow's nest has collapsed. Entire sections photographed in the 1980s no longer exist. Three-dimensional modeling has tracked the decay with clinical precision, and the conclusion is unambiguous. Within the coming generations, the Titanic as a recognizable structure will cease to be. The same steel hammered into shape by 14,000 workers in Belfast is being unmade, gram by gram, in the dark. The most recent missions have pushed the boundary of what we can send downward. The submersible limiting factor, built from titanium alloy and capable of multiple dives per day, represents the current limit of deep ocean exploration. It is a long distance from 1912. And yet what drives these expeditions, the need to see, to understand, to bear witness, is not so different from what drove the engineers who first drew plans for a ship that would be the largest thing that had ever moved. We keep building things to reach what we cannot yet touch. What I return to when I sit with all of this is not the scale of the disaster, it is the silence after it. 1,500 people vanished into water that, within hours, was perfectly still and unmarked. The Titanic ultimately teaches something older than any engineering lesson, that confidence carried past a certain threshold stops being a virtue and becomes something closer to blindness. The ocean did not acknowledge the mahogany paneling or the 4 magnificent funnels. It answered the hull breach with physics, nothing more. What remained, resting 4 kilometers beneath every argument about unsinkability, was not a monument to engineering, it was a monument to the people. The 1,500 who never came home, the 700 who carried that night inside them for the rest of their lives. The shoes, still arranged in the silt, still holding the shape of an absence no expedition has ever been able to fill. History is not a collection of dates. It is a living archive of who we were, what we lost, and what we chose to go back and find. The Titanic is still down there. The bacteria are still working. The silt is still settling. And somewhere in that quiet, irreversible unmaking, the ship is still asking the same question it asked on the morning of April 15, 1912. The question is whether we are willing to keep listening. There is always more to find. Go deeper. Keep exploring. The depth of history belongs to those who go looking.